Welcome to this week's episode of the Jewish Diaspora Report. On this week's episode, we're going to look into how the creation of the State of Israel caused a refugee problem in the Middle East, and how that system is still in place today. Let's get started. After a recent podcast discussing issues in Judea and Samaria, or the West Bank, and the history of the area, there were many questions asked or requests to discuss the issue of the refugee situation in the Middle East. For more background information on this, please check out our earlier episode on the Israeli apartheid fraud. The Middle East refugee crisis began in the 1940s. About 850,000 refugees gathered their belongings to leave their homes, businesses, and communities behind. Their families had lived in the area for hundreds or even thousands of years, some even dating back to the 6th century before the Common Era. They were not leaving due to their desire to emigrate or because they were being welcomed by another country, but leaving due to discrimination and physical risk by the local populations. Some of the refugees' bank accounts were frozen, others were imprisoned, some were banished and dispossessed by the local governments. Sadly, even some were killed in bombings. Some modern estimates suggest the refugees left behind about 40,000 square miles of land and assets worth approximately $250 billion today. This is the tragic story of the Mizrahi Jews, Jewish families who were living in the Arab and North African land since the time of the Bible. These families left everything behind in the face of increasing discrimination by countries that they had lived in for years. At the United Nations in 1947, Arab leaders warned what Jews in their countries would face if a Jewish state was declared in the British Mandate for Palestine. On the eve of the UN partition plan vote, the Iraqi foreign minister Fadil Jamali warned that, quote, "Masses in the Arab world cannot be restrained. The Arab-Jewish relations in the Arab countries will greatly deteriorate," and he was right. In 1947 and 1948 in Syria, anti-Jewish pogroms erupted in Aleppo, and the government froze all Jewish bank accounts. In Egypt, bombs were detonated in the Jewish quarter, killing dozens. In Algeria, anti-Jewish decrees were swiftly instituted, and in Yemen, bloody pogroms led to the death of nearly 100 Jews. In January 1948, the president of the World Jewish Congress appealed to the U.S. Secretary of State, saying that, quote, "Between 800,000 and 1 million Jews in the Middle East and North Africa, exclusive of Palestine, are in the greatest danger of destruction. Acts of violence already perpetrated, together with those contemplated, being clearly aimed at the total destruction of the Jews, constitutes a genocide, which under resolution of the General Assembly is a crime against humanity." Through a combination of persecution and mob violence, more than 99% of the region's Jews fled that region by the 1970s. So where did these Mizrahi Jews go? They became refugees and fled to the only place in the world that would take them, a brand new state of Israel. Upon their arrival in Israel, these Jewish immigrants who were forced to leave their homes overcame personal and communal tragedy, and they did not only persevere, but they thrived. As the majority left their property behind in their home countries to journey to Israel, many suffered from severe disease, and their socioeconomic status was affected by their cultural and political differences from those Israelis who had been in Palestine for generations. The incredibly new and fragile state of Israel took the burden of housing and providing social services for all of the refugees who came from across the world, having to assimilate, rehome, and support these people who had lost everything. Israel felt that it was their duty to take in these Jewish refugees facing hate and violence. Following the Holocaust, the country knew that it had a responsibility to protect Jews from future persecutions across the globe. This was officially later codified into Israeli law in the 1950s, in a law called the Law of Return. This law grants all Jews the right to seek refuge in Israel for safety. Mizrahi immigrants and refugees were placed in rudimentary and hastily erected tent cities, often in the developed towns or peripheries of Israel. Settlements in the Moshavim, or cooperative farming villages, were only partially successful because the Mizrahim had historically worked as craftsmen and merchants, and most did not traditionally engage in farm work. These settlements were eventually removed and dismantled as the refugees became successful Israeli citizens. They re-established businesses and obtained jobs in the new Israeli state. The Jewish Arab refugee story was a great success. Many rose to important positions in the national government and in public and private sectors. Many have made invaluable contributions to the fabric of the Israeli society. When we come back, we will discuss the more heavily referenced and more documented refugee crisis, the Palestinian refugees, when we return on the Jewish Diaspora Report. In our previous segment, we heard about the often lesser discussed refugee crisis of the 1940s, the Jewish refugees who were forced out of their Middle Eastern homes through violence and sanctions. We now look into the Palestinian refugees that we hear about all the time in the news. In the mid-1940s, the Arab Muslim population for British Mandate for Palestine was about 1 million. For the record, these were Arabs of various backgrounds living in Palestine, some for a number of years and others for many generations. These Arabs lived for many years under the British Empire and before that, the Ottoman Turks. In 1948, the War of Independence begins, and the newly created Arab states and the Arab League attack the day-old state of Israel. Their self-stated claim was to destroy the small Jewish state, and their secondary goal was to create a unified state for the Palestinians. As is the case in war, civilians who are caught in the middle of these warring armies have two choices. They can stay and hope to remain safe, or leave for safer grounds. This was the choice that many Arabs and Jews had in the area. Many Jewish civilians chose to stay and fight for the survival of their state and in many cases their own lives. Arab civilians who had on their side highly trained and highly equipped armies fighting on their behalf may have not felt as much of a call to stand up and fight against an army. So many of them chose to leave their homes for safety of the neighboring Arab nations temporarily. There is some documentation of Israeli army units asking local Arab populations to leave their homes. This could be for ideological reasons, asking them to leave because they wanted them out, or maybe for the Arab family's safety. Many of the Arab nations asked the local population to prepare to return home once they had ended the war with the Jewish state. Many of these 750,000 Arab refugees were funneled into various Arab countries in the neighboring areas. Syria, Lebanon, and Jordan, which included what is now known as the West Bank, and the Egyptian territory of Gaza. Since the Arab nations expected to destroy Israel, they set up temporary camps for these Arab refugees within their territory. Miraculously, the Arab nations lost the war against Israel, and Israel survived. Meanwhile, as the Israelis are accepting Jewish refugees from Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa, the Arab nations tell the refugees in the camps to hold on until a future war can happen and the Israeli state can be destroyed, at which point they'll be able to return to their homes in what is now Israel. While the Palestinian Arabs are now residing in a foreign country, they are not welcomed with open arms. Many Arab states choose to consider the refugees as, quote, stateless people, and do not provide the full citizenship or even much support to these Palestinian Arab refugees. When it becomes obvious that the Jewish state would not be wiped off the earth, policies of the Arab nations towards the refugees changed. The Arab nations' initial sympathy was coupled with the insistence on Israel's ultimate responsibility for them. As a result, most Arab governments strongly opposed the resettlement and naturalization of the refugees. Instead, they adopted policies and procedures aimed at preserving the Palestinian identity and their status as refugees. As the Arab nations maintained the refugee population in refugee camps and refused to absorb them into their own populations, they still had the ability and control over Gaza and the West Bank. They had every opportunity to create a Palestinian state in the areas that they controlled, but they never did. Was this because the Palestinian people didn't really want a partial state? It was sort of an all or nothing? Or was this because the Arab nations didn't care enough to give them the state that they promised? Was it maybe better to continue to use their plight as a reason for a future war against Israel? This essentially was the hope by the Arab armies in 1967, when the Arab nations once again attacked the Israeli state. Again, miraculously, the Israelis not only fought back against these armies, but gained more ground, taking over the land of West Bank and Gaza. This included many of the refugee camps that were initially created under the control of the Jordanians and the Egyptians. In subsequent peace talks between Egypt, Jordan, and Israel, Israel gave back land for peace and wanted to give back the West Bank and Gaza to their former countries. This included their refugee camps of the Palestinians. By now, the Palestinian Arab populations in Gaza and the West Bank became a thorn in the side of the Arab nations. For example, in the 1970s, the PLO, or Palestinian Liberation Organization, attempted to assassinate the King of Jordan, twice. The Arab countries were happy to see the Israeli state get stuck having to maintain this difficult population of revolutionaries and desperate civilians, who under the Arab nations had been kept in poor conditions in refugee camps with no chance of a life for over 30 years. When we come back, we will look into the refugee camps today, who controls them, and their Palestinian residents. We'll be right back after this on the Jewish Diaspora Report. In the previous segment, we saw that the Palestinian Arab population was held in refugee camps in poor conditions and were never provided full citizenship and in many cases even full rights. In 1950, the number of Palestinian Arab refugees was listed at over 500,000. By the 1980s, it was nearly 2 million. And by 2018, the number had risen to 5.5 million Palestinian Arab refugees. This number is staggering and still growing. The reason why, we'll get to in a moment. Today, there are about 70 or so refugee camps holding 30% of the Palestinian Arab population. Others live in their host countries with various levels of citizenship and rights. Some of you listeners may be a little bit surprised to hear how many of these Palestinian Arab refugee camps exist in the modern state of Israel today. The answer is none. Many people hear about the Palestinian refugee camps and instantly assume that these terrible places are to blame on the state of Israel, that the state of Israel is responsible for the poor treatment and conditions of Palestinian Arabs in refugee camps. But why? Why isn't the state of Jordan being blamed for the treatment of Palestinian refugees in their 13 Palestinian refugee camps? Why hasn't Jordan offered the 2.2 million refugees in their camps the right to join the already 1.8 million Palestinian Jordanians who live native in the country? Why isn't Syria being blamed for the treatment of refugees in their 12 Palestinian refugee camps? Or Lebanon in their 12? How is it the fault of Israel for these countries choosing not to provide asylum or support to the Palestinian people in their borders? Why have they chosen not to provide full citizenship or full rights to these Palestinian refugees? Here's a better question for you. Why do 8 refugee camps still exist in Gaza, which is under the full control of the Palestinian group Hamas? Should these Palestinians not just be living in the rest of Gaza with the other Palestinians? On that same note, why are those refugee camps in the West Bank that are under the control of the Palestinian Authority still in use? Why have these people not been, quote, resettled to the Palestinian territories and removed from the world's refugee numbers? This would explain why the number of Palestinian refugees is not decreasing. But how are these numbers of the Palestinian Arab refugees growing year after year? There are 2 reasons for this. Firstly, it seems that these Arab countries, including the Palestinian leadership themselves, want to keep their own people in terrible conditions rather than provide them with the freedom that they deserve. This ensures that the number of refugees does not drop, since these people are not being resettled or moved out of the camps into other areas of the country. Secondly, the United Nations ensures that under the UN Refugee Organization that Palestinians alone keep their refugee status in perpetuity. This is unheard of in any other place across the world. As an example, those Syrian refugees that fled the recent civil war and found refuge in North America are now citizens of the countries that accepted them. They and their children are no longer refugees. This is not the case for the Palestinian Arabs. Palestinian Arabs who fled the conflict in 1948 and 1967 went to various Arab states for safety. 30 years later, they are still kept in refugee camps, and the UN recognizes them and their offspring as forever refugees. The United Nations Relief and Work Agency for the Palestinian Refugees, a group responsible for only Palestinian refugees, has a budget of $1.6 billion US. Compare this to the $1 billion that is provided by the UN to all other refugees around the world. Nearly half of what the Palestinian refugees are given for support. Let's consider the numbers on this issue. The UN reports that there are approximately 27 million refugees around the world today, not including the Palestinian Arabs. Palestinian Arabs make up about 7 million refugees. This is approximately 20% of the world's refugee population. Consider that 20% of the world's refugee population gets nearly twice as much money as the rest of the 80% of refugees. I'm not sure if this is just cynical or realistic, but the fact that the Palestinian people are being supplied with billions of dollars a year from the international community in order to support their people being held in refugee camps at their own hands. I can understand why the Gazan and West Bank leadership wants to maintain the refugee system that allows them to remove the costs of feeding and healthcare for these people from their own budgets. What we can clearly see here is a system that is in place that maintains the refugee crisis by Arab nations, and even the Palestinians themselves, to ensure the Palestinian cause will never improve. Unfortunately, thanks to great public relations systems that are in place with social media and uneducated celebrities, somehow the reality of these camps, who controls them, and what country they're in, has completely been turned upside down. In the end, the fact that the Palestinian Arabs are being kept within a refugee camp system is tragic. We see that the Palestinian Arabs were not the only refugees created in the conflict in 1948, and that there was a major difference between the Jewish refugees and the Arab ones. One side, Israel, chose to risk their own economic survival and take their refugees out of their temporary camps, provide them with social support, and make them citizens. We can see that Israel did actually create a refugee crisis. Israel's very existence caused hundreds of thousands of Jewish Arabs to become refugees when the Arab nations retaliated against their historic Jewish populations. Israel's survival in 1948 also gave reasons for the Arab nations to keep their Palestinian Arab populations in what were supposed to be temporary camps. Israel's continued survival in 1967 gave the Arab countries reasons for those camps to become permanent. This seems like win-win for the Arab nations who get to use this as a weapon against the state of Israel, blame them for the refugee crisis while gaining billions of dollars in support. So next time you hear the term Palestinian refugee camp, hopefully you'll be able to better understand where these camps are located, who is keeping these poor groups in this cycle of perpetual poverty and refugee status, and that you and your country through the United Nations might be funding this cycle. This has been another episode of the Jewish Diaspora Report. Don't forget to check us out on social media at jdr.podcast and check out some of our other episodes on your favorite podcast source. We'll see you next time.